Okay. So picture this. You're in a country, and everyone around you, like everyone you know, is on strike. It's not just a small group. It's two-thirds of the workforce. Can you imagine? That was France in May 1968.
Yeah, May 68, it's one of those moments that, really makes you think.
It definitely does.
I mean, how does a country that's, on the surface doing pretty well, prosperous, suddenly just erupt like that?
It's a great question, and that's what we're diving into today.
Absolutely.
We're looking at The Rest is History, their episode on May 68 in France.
It's a good one.
It is, and I think it's relevant for us even today.
Oh, absolutely. It really shows how even when times are good, economically, you can have all these social and cultural undercurrents just waiting to, well, explode.
Yeah, exactly. So let's set the scene a little. France in the 1960s.
Okay.
On one hand, you've got this booming economy, a growing middle class, even like a bit of that Mad Men vibe,
Oh, wow. Right.
But then on the other hand,
You have this simmering discontent, especially among younger people.
they're starting to question everything.
Yeah, the old values, the education system, France's place in the world, especially the Vietnam War going on.
And then, of course, you have Charles de Gaulle leading the country.
Yeah, de Gaulle, towering figure, war hero, the guy who basically saved France in World War II.
Exactly. But by the late 60s, even his image was starting to, lose some of his shine.
He was seen as part of the old guard, clinging to a vision of France that just didn't resonate with a lot of people anymore, especially the younger generation.
It's like he was stuck in the past, maybe?
In a way, yeah. I mean, imagine being so used to being right, to being in charge, that you just don't see the changes happening around you.
That's a good point.
And that's kind of what happened with de Gaulle.
So how did things actually boil over? How do we go from this simmering discontent to, well, full-blown crisis?
Well, it started with something small, almost insignificant, at least at first. Nanterre University, just outside Paris, a group of students started protesting.
Classic student protest, right? What were they upset about?
A lot of things, actually. The rigid rules, the curriculum felt outdated.
They didn't feel heard, basically.
Exactly. They wanted an education that was relevant to their lives, to the social and political issues of the time.
So it was about more than just, wanting easier exams or something.
Oh, yeah, much more. This was part of a bigger trend. Remember, this was the era of Vietnam War protests, the civil rights movement.
A time of global unrest.
Absolutely. Young people all over the world were challenging the status quo.
And these students at Nanterre, they were part of that.
They were, and their protest, as small as it seemed, it became a spark.
A spark that lit a much bigger fire.
Right, because the protests spread from Nanterre to the Sorbonne, right in the heart of Paris.
And that's when things really escalated, right?
Yeah, the authorities responded with force, with police crackdowns.
And that just made things worse, didn't it?
It did. It completely backfired. I mean, images of students clashing with police, it was all over the news.
It turned a local protest into a national issue.
Exactly. The government, instead of calming things down, they actually made it bigger.
So we've got these student protests growing, spreading.
And then something really interesting happens. Workers across the country, they start to walk out in solidarity.
Wow. So it's not just students anymore.
No, it becomes this massive labor movement.
How many people went on strike?
2/3 of the workforce.
2/3. That's incredible. What did that look like? Factories shutting down, transportation halted?
All of that. Yeah, the country basically ground to a halt.
Wow, that's a powerful statement.
It showed how deep the discontent really ran. It wasn't just a few students, it was a whole segment of society.
And for de Gaulle, this must have been a real blow.
Yeah, this was the guy who had built his career on being the strong, unifying leader, the savior of France.
And now he's facing a crisis that's tearing the country apart.
Exactly, and it's fascinating to look at how he responded because it wasn't what anyone expected.
So last time we left off with France basically in chaos, students protesting, workers on strike, and de Gaulle, the guy who always seemed so in control, well, he wasn't looking so steady anymore.
No, not at all. It was a real test for him.
I can't even imagine the pressure he must have been under.
You have to remember, this is a man who had stared down Hitler.
Right. Faced down the Nazis, liberated France.
Exactly. And now he's facing this internal crisis, a challenge to his authority from his own people.
It must have felt like a real betrayal in a way.
There's actually an anecdote from that time, the historians mentioned it, where de Gaulle compares the situation to the fall of France in 1940.
Wow, so he's equating this to one of the darkest moments in French history.
Yeah, and you have to remember, he experienced that personally. He was there, so for him to even bring it up, it shows just how deeply this crisis affected him.
It really does. So what did he do? How did he react to this immense pressure?
Well, he made a decision that shocked everyone.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat.
It's the night of May 28th, 1968. De Gaulle is in the Élysée Palace, surrounded by advisors, and he decides to flee Paris.
He fled. Seriously.
Yeah, and not just to some country estate. He actually went to Germany,
Do
to a French military base in Baden-Baden.
I mean, I know things were bad, but to actually abandon the capital, that seems, I don't know, almost cowardly.
It was a huge risk, no doubt about it, and it created this immediate power vacuum.
Right. Who's in charge now?
His prime minister, Georges Pompidou, is left to handle the mess.
Can you imagine the rumors, the speculation? The leader of the country just disappears.
It must have been complete chaos.
It sounds like the plot of a movie.
It does, doesn't it?
So de Gaulle is in Germany. What's his next move?
He reaches out to an old ally, General Jacques Massu.
Massu. Why him specifically?
Well, Massu was a decorated general, known for his loyalty to de Gaulle.
Okay, so a trusted figure.
And crucially, he commanded French troops stationed in Germany.
Ah, so de Gaulle needs to know where the army stands.
Exactly. Remember, this is a time when a military coup was a real possibility.
Right, so this meeting with Massu, it's high stakes.
Very high stakes. De Gaulle needs to know if he has the army's support.
So what happened?
Well, according to the historians, it was a turning point.
Okay.
Massu reassures de Gaulle of his loyalty, and more importantly, he says the army is willing to intervene if needed.
Wow, so that's a big boost for de Gaulle.
It was the lifeline he needed. It gave him the confidence to come back to Paris.
So he returns, but I'm guessing he doesn't just quietly slip back into the Élysée Palace.
No, not at all. He comes back with a bang.
Of course he does.
He gives this powerful radio address.
Okay, what does he say?
He calls for order. He frames the crisis as a choice between him and the communists.
Strong word.
And then he announces that he's dissolving parliament and calling for new elections.
So he's basically putting his fate in the hands of the people.
He is. It's a gamble, a very bold move.
And did it pay off? It did pay off in a big way.
You know, it's amazing how a single speech can change everything.
It really is what happened.
Well, de Gaulle's speech really galvanized his supporters, people who had been, kind of quiet during all the chaos. They suddenly felt like they had to do something.
Like he gave them permission to speak up.
Yeah, and it wasn't just words, it was action too. Hundreds of thousands of people poured into the streets of Paris.
Wow, a counter-protest.
Yeah, a massive show of support for de Gaulle.
So you have these images of, people waving French flags, chanting Vive de Gaulle?
Exactly. It was a powerful visual, a real contrast to the images of the protests.
It was de Gaulle at his best, using symbolism and spectacle to rally the nation.
He was a master of that.
So this was a turning point then. I mean, the momentum shifted back in de Gaulle's favor.
Absolutely. And he took full advantage. He called for new elections in June 1968.
And how did that go?
Landslide victory for de Gaulle's party.
So the revolution failed, the protests died down, France went back to, I don't know, business as usual.
On the surface, yeah, but the thing is, May 68 had this lasting impact, even though the revolution itself didn't succeed.
I see. So it's not just about the immediate outcome, it's about the longer-term consequences.
Right. It forced France and really a lot of the Western world to look at some uncomfortable truths.
Like what?
Social inequalities, outdated institutions, this gap between generations, all these things were brought to light.
It's like May 68 shook things up, even if it didn't completely overturn them.
That's a good way to put it. And one of the most surprising legacies of May 68 is its impact on, intellectuals, thinkers like Michel Foucault.
Ah, Foucault. Yeah, we talked about him a little earlier. He was actually pretty critical of the student movement, wasn't he?
He was, but he was also deeply engaged with the events of May 68, and his ideas about power, about surveillance, they resonated with a lot of people.
And not just in France, right?
No, his work became really influential in American academia in the 1970s.
That's interesting. So a French philosopher analyzing a failed revolution in his own country ends up shaping intellectual thought in the U.S.
Yeah, and it makes sense when you think about it. The U.S. in the 1970s, there was Vietnam, Watergate, a lot of disillusionment with authority.
So Foucault's ideas about how power works in subtle ways, they provided a framework for understanding these events.
Exactly. And he gave us this vocabulary, concepts like institutional racism and the panopticon.
It's like he gave a voice to those who felt marginalized, who were questioning the system.
He did, and it's interesting, May 68 also influenced conservative thinkers, people like Roger Scruton.
Oh, right. He was a young student in Paris at the time, wasn't he?
He was, and he witnessed the chaos firsthand, and it had the opposite effect on him. He became disillusioned with what he saw as the excesses of the left.
So the same event leads to different interpretations, different reactions.
Yeah, it shows how complex history is, how there's never one single narrative.
It's all about perspective, isn't it?
I think so, and that's why May 68 is still relevant today. It reminds us that even when things seem stable, there are always these underlying tensions, these forces pushing for change.
And those forces can erupt in unexpected ways.
They can. It makes you wonder how future generations will look back on our time, on the protests and movements happening today.
What will they see as turning points? What will be forgotten? It's a question worth thinking about.
It is, and I think that's the real lesson of May 68. It's not just a story about a failed revolution. It's a reminder that history is always in motion, that change is constant, and that we all have a role to play in shaping the future.
Well said, and I think that's a good place to wrap up our deep dive into May 68. It's a story that reminds us that the past is never truly over, that it continues to influence our present in ways we might not even realize.
Absolutely.
So until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those historical wheels turning.